Many Oxfordians believe that the true author of Shakespeare's plays was an aristocrat named Edward de Vere. As regards for the authorship of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, it has been suggested that Edward wrote these under the criticism of Shakespeare, both to avoid breaking a voluntary conviction against aristocrats publishing poetry and plays and to escape the consequences of the subject matter he was writing about. Therefore, we stand resolved that the works of William Shakespeare should be attributed to Edward de Vere. I'm going to start with some definitions. Contemporary, existing, occurring, or living at the same time, belonging to the same time. Assertion, a positive statement or declaration, often without support or reason. Ascribed, to edit or to credit or assign as to cause or source. Prominent, standing out so as to be easily seen and intently without skill or aptitude for a particular task or assignment. My partner and I believe Edward de Vere is the true author of the works that are traditionally attributed to William Shakespeare for the following reasons. It is recognized by Oxfordians that Stanfordians alike that writing about royal courts, Italy, and law require a certain level of education status. Edward de Vere fits the bill here since he is known to have graduated from Cambridge University at age 14 and becoming Master of Arts at age 16. Furthermore, in the views of the plays which discussed law, de Vere studied law at Gray's Inn, according books clearly showed that Edward de Vere had extensive library underlining his qualifications to write as knowledgeably as Shakespeare. To further prove that Edward de Vere was qualified to write settings ascribed to Shakespeare, Edward de Vere is known as to travel to Italy in the 1570s, putting him in the ideal position to write knowledgeably about Venice. My second point, similarities between Edward de Vere's life and Hamlet suggest that Hamlet was almost an autobiographical play about Earl's life. Notably, the line, young men falling out at tennis, is to believe to refer to Edward de Vere's notorious tennis court scrabble with Sidney. Notably, de Vere's father-in-law, William, is said to have been the character. Only a person intimately knowledgeable of Lord Berkeley's life could parody this man in Hamlet. Furthermore, Edward de Vere fits the historical assertion in Sonnet 125 that Shakespeare bore the company over Queen Elizabeth in victory celebration over the defeat of the Spanish Armada. He was made royal and sent to study at the Queen's College in Cambridge after the death of his father. He then received legal training at Gray's Inn. Later, he was a part of Queen Elizabeth in Cambridge and on a royal visit to Oxford in 1666 and was awarded a degree from the university. He didn't get either of his degrees by normal academic process, claimed Professor Alan Hay Nelson, author of The Monstrous Adversary, The Life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Any visiting nobleman attending the councilment could just walk up and ask for a degree. He'd been given one. The young earl then spent 16 months in the tour of France, Germany, Italy in 1575, and Oxfordians believe the detail in some as of Shakespeare's plays benefited from these travels aboard. He had a very prominent political career at court, Dr. Egan said. He was one of the jurists who sat in the judgment on the Earl of Essex at his treason trial. Academics have never found a single document which proves Shakespeare was an author. From contemporary documents to have been discovered, we know the man's interest has conducted a number of business transactions, which include a small share of the Globe Theatre. 6 and trebly planned signatures are the only examples that we have of his ability to be a writer. There are no letters from his wife to his wife. There are certainly no original literary manuscripts. There is no documentation that William Shakespeare went to school. Where did he learn all the different types of slang that he used in the plays? Mark Twain asks. How could a man that couldn't even write his name write such plays? Edward de Vere must have gone to college because he had the slang for all of the plays that were written. He knew how they were to be talked about because he was of noble standment. And a nobleman usually would write under a false name because it was frowned upon to work with actors and playwrights if a nobleman such as Edward de Vere were to write plays in the open and write his name and publish them. But he would leave clues to who he was, such as Shakespeare, which his name was Spear Shaker.
Okay, first I'm going to start off with the definition of author, which is a person who writes a novel, poem, essay, etc. The composer of a literary work as distinguished from a compiler, translator, editor, or copyist. The reason I give this definition is because it says nothing about being the publisher of said work that he may have done. First off, when it says Shakespeare traveled, he had plenty of time to do all this work if he may have traveled. It never said what he traveled for, so who knows what he traveled for. He may have just been a traveling author. It never actually gives, nowhere in any of the research I did does it give a strong definition of what he traveled for. And coming to the next point of Hamlet being quote-unquote autobiography, there was a large portion of Shakespeare's work that didn't match any of de Vere's work because de Vere wrote his own poems and had them published under his name. Shakespeare didn't until he passed, or he died whenever he died. So when those two added up, there was a large portion that didn't match the writing style of de Vere and match the writing style of Shakespeare. That was in the recent Shakespeare's Clinic under the direction of Robert Valenza and Ward Ellicott from the Claremont McKenna College. Let's see. And another large hole in the argument of de Vere is that not only did Shakespeare's work get published, but a large portion of his work that was claimed by de Vere was not given to him until after de Vere died in 1604. And the quote that I found from the website, which the website was the de Vere Authorship Argument. It was, a large problem for Edward de Vere authoring Shakespeare's work is in fact that he died in 1604. This was roughly 12 plays ascribed to Shakespeare, or this is before roughly 12 plays ascribed to Shakespeare were composed. So it's saying that he died before the plays were ascribed to Shakespeare. So if he had died, why wouldn't they have given him his plays that he had originally created? Though there may not have been documentation of him going to school, how would he have known all of these words? Maybe he was homeschooled, or maybe because his family were noblemen, they had the money to afford a homeschool teacher. Well, just because he went to law school, how exactly would you know the poetry and the colorful language that he learned? It's kind of a double negative, I guess. And then it brings me to another point, that when William Shakespeare had worked for the theater, De Vere was actually working for another theater on the other side of town that was a rival theater to the Globe Theater. So why would he be writing plays for an opposite theater to do? There's not a whole lot of logic within that. So during that time, De Vere was still working for the opposite or the opposing theater on the other side of town. Shakespeare was still in the process of writing his plays, and De Vere was writing his own plays and poems for his theater and working in that theater in those plays. Shakespeare was working in the plays that he wrote in the Globe Theater on his side of town. They were opposing theaters that would have no need to be writing plays for each other when you have one playwright in one theater and one playwright in the other theater. There's no point in writing a play for each other. There's no point in De Vere stealing Shakespeare's work or Shakespeare stealing De Vere's work or taking claim for the other one when they're in opposing theaters. And during that time, the two theaters were closed on June 23rd, 1592, due to the plague. So they both had time to create more plays. So they were still working for the rival theaters, even though the theaters closed. But that would be the time where they wrote their sonnets, which is what gave De Vere his credibility and gave Shakespeare his credibility, because of the fact that there's such a difference in the writing styles of the sonnets. That would be what gave the difference between the two writers. Also because of the fact that Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, was known to have composed, directed, and acted in plays during the same time as Shakespeare. That's what caused the problem of when the theaters closed, when they started to write their sonnets. When they wrote their sonnets, obviously, as I said before, that's what gave them their credibility, but they were still in the separate acting troupes. So during that time, with the theaters being closed while they wrote their plays, that's what set them apart.
I am the second negative. I'm attacking my opponent's case. They said in their first contention that writing about the courts required a level of education. They said that there is no evidence that William Shakespeare had gone to school, but you needed a higher level of education to write about courts. And they had evidence saying that he went to Cambridge, and that Edward de Vere went to Cambridge and had a education from there to write, and possibly learned to write about things such as arts, and was able to write like Shakespeare. But going through research, I have found that William Shakespeare did have a education He went to the University of King Edward VI and Stratford upon Avon. And my second contention about this, they had said that Hamlet was almost a play about Earl's life and Edward de Vere's life. Almost is a big word there. They can't prove it. If you can't prove that it was an autobiography of someone's life, then how can you use it as a factor saying that this is his writing? So from there, we don't know. Or from there, we can't prove that Edward de Vere had used Shakespeare's writing or had been Shakespeare's writer. And their third contention, they said again that there is no documentation that William Shakespeare had any schooling upon his life. And again, he did have schooling. He did use it. And in his schooling, he learned to write. He learned to read. And even though they say that he can't even write his own name, that he was able to write many, many plays and have them performed by his own self. In this the Oxford boys, in my conclusion, Edward de Vere was a leaseholder of the Blackfriars Theatre. And back then, the Blackfriars Theatre was a rival to the Globe Theatre. Therefore, rivals will contest, and the rivals were Edward de Vere and William Shakespeare. Even though they rivaled in playwrights, they have back in documentation that William Shakespeare has had Edward de Vere as one of his greater friends, according to the Edward de Vere biography, that video that we had watched. So, in conclusion, why would you have a rival make your plays become actual plays and poems and books and stories as to doing it yourself and dying without finishing it?
I'm the second affirmative attacking the negative case. As their first contention, it says it was a large problem for Edward de Vere authoring Shakespeare's work, knowing that he died in 1604 and there was roughly 12 plays ascribed to Shakespeare. Well, my argument against that is, even though he died, his family's still alive, so it would have been frowned upon because they were noblemen. Their second argument is William had probably been working as an actor and writer on the professional stage in London. And how would Edward de Vere know colorful language? Edward de Vere knew colorful language because he was part of the traveling play group, the Oxford Boys. And their third contention was Edward had no reason to be the author of Shakespeare's plays if he had his own theater and plays? Well, he could have been writing more advanced plays for Shakespeare and then writing less advanced plays for his own theater, so his family wouldn't get frowned upon.
Okay, first, I'd like to rebuild on the fact that Shakespeare's family was also of noble birth, so why, if De Vere's family was such a noble birth, why would they use Shakespeare's name if Shakespeare's family still had nobility in the name? They may not have been of such high ranking in the courts, but they were still of a higher social class than most. Also, when they said that because he learned the colorful language from a traveling theater, well, Shakespeare's been in the theater basically his entire life and would know just as much of the colorful language as De Vere would. So maybe that's how he would have learned the same way that De Vere did, or vice versa. And to rebuild my third point, De Vere was the leaseholder of the Blackfriar Theater, which would make him the owner of the Blackfriar Theater, and Shakespeare held shares of stock in the Globe Theater. So neither of them had anything to do with the other theater, so why would there be one writing a play for the other or one writing for the other indefinitely? They were rival theaters in the fact that they both were competing to own the play business in the town they were in. So why would they write plays for each other? In conclusion, Shakespeare may have been, or De Vere may have been a noble birth, but so was Shakespeare. Shakespeare learned a lot of his language from the theater, as well as De Vere did. And they both had stocks and shares of stock and lease of their own opposing theaters.
Okay, so for my first contention, it says that my opponent said that he had schooling, that he might have been homeschooled, but there was no proof that he had schooling past the age of 14 when his father was no longer a part of the main courts because he got into some dirty dealing. We have that his dad was a glove maker, a leather maker, and he got into some dirty dealings. He built himself up in the courts, but then he was excluded from it because his dirty dealings or whatever. And then we have that Shakespeare might have he performed in the plays that he supposedly wrote, but we're not sure how he was able to do that. He learned his colorful language from being in the theater, and that De Vere had his own theater as well. But he was of more noble birth. It was not so much frowned upon for William Shakespeare to work in the theater, but it would have been much more frowned upon if Edward de Vere would have worked more closely in the theater instead of just barely on the surface and having the bill for the theater would have just gave him more money, which would have built him up in the stature, but he could have had more interest in building a higher playwright for himself. Edward de Vere would have liked to better himself in playwriting instead of. Anywho, in conclusion, we believe that Edward de Vere would still have been in the theater, but would have been writing more superior plays so that his family would not have been frowned upon.
In conclusion, we have resolved, my partner and I, that the plays of William Shakespeare should not be attributed to Edward de Vere. Our position stands strongly where it is started. We believe that William Shakespeare was the original writer of his work. Therefore, he was the author of his work. If Edward de Vere were to do anything upon any of his work, then it would to officially publish William Shakespeare's plays, poetry, and life work. It had said that William Shakespeare, or Edward de Vere, had written 125 sonnets, and everyone thought that they were William Shakespeare. He could conclude that he had used William Shakespeare's work as an anchor to spring upon his own type of writing. Therefore, in conclusion, we stand for William Shakespeare.
In conclusion, my partner and I believe that honors must be attributed to Edward de Vere as the true author of William Shakespeare's sonnets and plays. We believe he should be honored because they both could avoid breaking a voluntary convention against aristocrats publishing poetry and plays to escape the consequences of the matter they were writing about. My partner and I want to see an injustice of mistaken identity rectified. And it's time to change the books and name Edward de Vere as the greatest writer of all time. So my partner and I stand strongly that Edward de Vere was a true writer of William Shakespeare's plays and sonnets.